Hello everyone, how are you doing? Welcome to this week's Middlegame show with me, Miss Strategy. Since the World Chess Championship has finished, I thought that we should get back to our normal learning schedule, and we will once again study some concepts in the middle game and then practice them in thematic tournaments. So today we are going to learn about minor pieces, especially the pair of bishops. That's our today's topic. And next Wednesday you will have a chance to practice what we have learned today in a thematic tournament with my live commentary. Those of you who have participated already, you know that this is a tournament where we begin with a position that is maybe from a game that we have seen together or a similar position, and you will be practicing the concepts that we studied together. It's unrated, I could manage to pronounce, unrated tournament. Important because when there's a disadvantage from one side, of course we don't want you to lose rating points because of practicing what we learned today. So don't worry about your rating points, it will be an unrated tournament just in order to practice everything that we have learned in these middle game shows, especially what we learned today about the pair of bishops. So let's jump right into the topic, and we will have two brilliant games, one by Mikhail Tal and another by Garry Kasparov. The first one of Tal is actually a game that he loses, but I promise that Kasparov's game is not a loss. He will win in a brilliant style with the black pieces against Alexei Shirov. But first, before we begin analyzing these games, I wanted to show you a cartoon because we have just received a very funny image from Guadalupe. What do you think about it, guys? Who do you think are those girls? Oh, this way. Who do you think they are? What is this picture about? Let me know in the chat and also on YouTube in the comments if you recognize those two ladies. What are they doing in the picture and what is it about these stones and the Miss Strategy, Miss Tactics? Actually, it's written on it, so I guess you know who are they. You definitely know which one is me. I do have very similar hair, isn't it similar? Yeah, kind of similar. And what is this concept about my Miss Strategy stone being down here and Miss Tactics holding it up here? What is the position that is in the image? Do you recognize it? Have you seen it in one of our shows, or maybe it's a position from a video series? Let me know if you recognize it. So after this happiness moment of showing my own cartoon with Miss Tactics, Sopika Goramishvili, let's just begin with the learning. Because that's why you are here. You want to improve your middle game tactics, middle game technique. Now that I said Miss Tactics, I will say tactics the whole show. We are improving our middle game strategy. Tactics sometimes, but mostly concepts. Maneuvering, planning, and just knowing what to play for and how to play for what you want to achieve. So, as I said, we begin with a game of Mikhail Tal, a game that he loses. And if you see his opponent's name, that is Rashid Nesmedninov. Perhaps you have heard about him, but he's not so famous. And that's such a pity because actually he was a very strong player. He was, of course, you see that if he played with Tal, he is a colleague of Tal. They faced each other many times, and he is one of those few players who had a plus score against Tal. During his whole life, he had a plus score against the former world champion. So I think that's a big deal. And in this game too, Nesmedninov just crushes Mikhail Tal. So of course, Tal had a very high opinion of Nesmedninov. He said that his games reveal the beauty of chess and make you love in chess not so much the points and high placings, but the wonderful harmony and elegance of this particular word. So let's learn more about this wonderful harmony of chess and the elegance of the bishop pair, because white will have the pair of bishops and the opening is my favorite opening. So once again, my favorite opening just gets destroyed. It's the French defense. I play it with the black pieces. Sorry, today I'm confusing all sorts of words. I hope you can excuse me. I'll try to speak somewhat slower. The bishop b4 variation of the French is a line, of course, that is a main line, but I stopped playing it because of a very personal reason. I don't like to give up my bishop. At least not in this way. I do play, for instance, the Rossolimo against the Sicilian. I can show you, like, this is the way that I do like to give up my bishop this way. So one opening where white gives up their bishop in order to destroy the opponent's pawn structure, or actually double the pawns. It's not like it's a very bad pawn structure, but it's to imbalance the position. It's the Rossolimo, and I do like this opening as white. The funny thing is that as black, I don't like giving up my bishop, at least not in the French. So when we reach this position, I always play the knight f6 line lately. I used to play bishop b4, but nowadays I go for knight f6 because of the very simple reason that I don't want to give up my dark squared bishop. I feel like that these positions, even though they are main lines, so this is just normal. It's normal to play this position. These positions, this is a basic position in this bishop b4 line, is all about black playing against the bad pawn structure of white, trying to get a strategic edge, and white trying to be dynamic and take advantage of the pair of bishops, and also the more space that white has always in the French defense. So I do prefer white in this line, and it's just an equal position. It's very personal. You can let me know if you feel the same way as I do, or maybe you prefer the knights in this position, maneuvering, and you see those double pawns and you are like, in an endgame I will win. Yeah, but you need to survive the middle game, because what I don't like about these positions is that my king is always under attack. After queen g4, this g7 pawn is hanging, and what you should not do when your bishop is off of the board is to push g6. This is what you should never do. Once you exchange a bishop, especially if you give up your bishop for another piece, a knight, so it's not for the other bishop, it means that white still has the dark squared bishop and you don't. So if you start weakening the dark squares, they are going to be huge holes in your play. Look at that king side, look at the f6, the g7, the h6 squares, they are all big holes in black's position. And this is what you should avoid. So if you give up your bishop for a knight, or for a rook, if you win an exchange, just try not to weaken the squares that are on the color of the bishop that you don't have. Therefore, after queen g4, any move is acceptable, but not g6. g6 is not a losing move, but that's not a move that a French defense player should think about. You should always, even giving up the pawn, queen c7 is one of the main lines, is a good idea, because this is a mess after rook g8 and then you capture on d4. It's a mess, all these lines, but it's better to give up that pawn for a complicated position than to play g6. Or even king f8 is possible, and of course castle. Castle is the most natural in my opinion. And you should know what happens after moves like bishop h6. Not that it's the most dangerous, but anyway, this is all opening theory. What I want to emphasize here is that once your bishop is off of the board, you should be very careful about not weakening the squares that are on the same color. So here the dark squares, you need to be so careful about the dark squares. Let's see what happened in the game. Bishop b4, e5, c5, and bishop d2 is a sideline. The idea is, of course, that white wants to capture on c3 with the bishop. He doesn't want to double his pawns. You could say that it's an improvement, but it takes time to place your bishop on c3, and many times you will end up having your bishop on d4. After c takes d4, bishop takes d4, knight c6 could be played, and that means that your bishop will be eventually captured. Although white is not so afraid of this. So when you have the pair of bishops, it's good to have it, but don't be too afraid of giving it back. Don't be too afraid of giving up one bishop, especially if it's your bad bishop, because in the French you have two bishops. Which one is the good one, which one is the bad one? The so-called good bishop is the light squared bishop, because that's the bishop that will attack black's king. Black will castle kingside and you will attack it with bishop d3, queen h5. So your bad bishop is the one that is on the same color as your pawns in the center, the dark squared bishop. Not that it's so bad. I would say that black's bishop is a lot worse. It's a poor bishop that has no diagonals for the moment. That's always a problem in the French, but in general, As white against the French, you always want to keep your light square bishop, and the dark square bishop sometimes you keep, sometimes you don't. It's not a problem if it's exchanged. b6 was played by Tal, and here Nesmedino went for b4, immediately trying to open the position, because when you have bishops, you should thrive to open the position. Bishops love diagonals. You cannot have a very closed position and try to take advantage of your pair of bishops. No, that's the position for knights, for outposts, for maneuvers. You need to open the position for your bishop. So that's what he's doing, b4. You might say, what if c4? Like, b4 is provoking the closing of the queen side. True, partially. But black doesn't want to play c4 because c4 is a move that, yes, keeps the position closed, but at the same time, now white has a free hand at attacking on the king side. That's where white can easily attack with a move like queen g4, later on bringing more pieces. It's not like you give mate immediately, but it's so easy to attack on the king side. There are no defenders on the king side. And secondly, the move c4 closes the position, but not completely. You can always play a4 later on as white if you wish. And third, and I think that's the most important, this bishop is dead. If you play c4 as black, it means that you are just basing your whole plan on passive defense. This bishop on c8 is crying. It's such a poor piece. It has no diagonals and no hopes at all in the future for a diagonal. So c4 is therefore a move that players who love the French defense should not consider in this position, because you want to keep the position dynamic. The point of the French defense is that you give up space in the center, but then you attack the center. So keep the pawn on c5 and play queen c7. You want to attack those central pawns and not keep them there. You want to actually do something about your c8 bishop at some point. If not, it's just a bad position. Knight f3, and here Tal suggests, after the game, he thought that it was better to capture here on b4. I want to show you the idea because it's connected to how to play with and against the pair of bishops. His idea was that after c takes b4, bishop takes b4, a5 would have been a very strong move, because bishop d6, even though it looks like a great move, is bad. Queen c3, and white cannot play queen d2, the rook would be hanging, and if you go knight d2, then the pawn on d4 is hanging. So yeah, this position is bad for white. That's why he has to go back with the bishop to d2, and in this moment, finally French players will shout the move. Bishop a6, that's what you want to do in the French defense. So, you keep the position dynamic and then you exchange your bad bishop. You want to exchange this bishop for white's good bishop. That's a basic strategy in the French defense, and once you do it, you are happy. Not that it's the end of the game, there's still a lot to play for, but this is a first step to accomplish as black. So yes, I agree that Tal's comment that here in this moment it was a good idea to take on b4, play very dynamic, and then after a5, bishop a6, but he didn't. And we will see that knight d7 is not a bad move either. He keeps the position dynamic, but suddenly bishop e2, and you still have this bishop on the board. With the knight on d7, it's unlikely that you will ever exchange it. You will have to play a5, and even after that, it's not sure that you can exchange this bishop. So, not easy anymore. He could have tried c takes d4, bishop takes, and knight c6. And in this moment, you see that the bishop is hanging and the pawn on e5 is hanging too. So this should be a good variation for black, shouldn't it? The funny thing about this position is that, first of all, the good move for white is very funny. Rook c1. Mysterious move that you will soon understand. If black takes the bishop, after queen takes d4, the c2 pawn is not hanging. That's a good point for rook c1. Secondly, if black captures the pawn on e5, because that's the main question, isn't it? What happens if this pawn is captured? We take, And I want you to think about this position for a moment, because as white, we have just lost a pawn. Think about this position and evaluate it. Do you think that it was worth giving up this pawn for the pair of bishops, so that our bishop was not captured, but our pawn was? We have lost a pawn. What would you do here as white? I let you think about this for a moment. Not this picture. I wanted to bring up the time to think, but that's a good one too. Some really good thoughts there in the chat. Thank you guys. F4 is of course a move that you should consider. It's a very aggressive move, attacking the knight in the center. And another move that one should consider is C4. And that's why the rook on C1 is actually a very useful piece, because you know that when you have the pair of bishops, you want to open the position. So C4 is actually a very good move in this position. Let's just see an example what could happen after c4. Of course, black cannot allow c takes d5. So instead, if he plays d takes c4, let's say, now f4. So we combine the two ideas, chasing away the knight from the center, and it doesn't matter where the knight goes, most likely c6. We take the pawn on c4, and this is a position where we still have a pawn down as white. But look at that rook on the c5, look at the bishop on d4, and also the e2 bishop will soon have a diagonal for sure. A move like bishop f3 is very annoying, and also sometimes this bishop can appear on b5. So many times what you will see when playing with a pair of bishops or against it, that a pawn sacrifice is worth it. If you can open the position for the pair of bishops, it is worth a pawn. It is worth at least a pawn, because the bishops become so much more powerful in open positions that a pawn down is actually not a big deal. This position I do prefer as white. Of course you should calculate in this position, because the f4 pawn is hanging, isn't it hanging like, not in this case, sorry, I'm mixing up two lines that I wanted to show you. I wanted to show you a different position where the pawn will be hanging. Let me go there if I already mentioned. I wanted to say that here, if we take with the bishop, it's very tempting, threatening bishop b5. And this is a moment where the pawn could be taken. Sorry that I confused the two variations that I wanted to show you. And here it feels like bishop b5 is winning. The knight is pinned and we are attacking it with two pieces. But unfortunately for white, black has some tactics working in his favor. Bishop defending the knight, and after we take, win the piece on c6. Queen e4 wins the rook. So sometimes nasty tactics work against us, because our king is in the middle of the board still. If we could have castled already, this would not be a problem and our pawn would not be hanging on f4. That's why after the knight move to c6, it's better to capture with the rook on c4. And in this case, of course, there's no such thing as queen f4. The knight is hanging on c6. Another cute line that I wanted to show you is that bishop a6 could be tempting to get rid of our bishop on e2, but now bishop e5 is an intermediate move attacking the queen, and rook takes c6. And what do you think about this position where we have a pair of bishops for a rook and a pawn? So in this game you will see many different positions, and I always want you to think about these transitions because it will happen in your games too, that sometimes the position is balanced, then you have a bishop against a knight, then you have, I don't know, you sacrifice a pawn, you have a pair of bishops, then you have an exchange up but for a minor piece and pawns. So during a game you will have to analyze many different positions and evaluate them. What do you think about this position for white? Do you like this position? A pair of bishops for a rook and a pawn. And also please think about queen takes g2. Do you think that's a good move for black? I would love to hear your opinion on that. I'll give you some time. You guys are right. Once again, well done. I do prefer as well the bishops here. The bishops are very active. That's important to note. And also that the rooks in the corner are not activated yet. If black captures on the g2, that's very dangerous, as you guys have noted. Let me just show you what would happen after queen takes g2. It's a mistake, a huge mistake, because it allows the move that you have said. Many of you have said it in the chat. Bishop b5 check. And look at this position after king f8, queen d6 check. You don't have to calculate all this in order to decide whether queen takes g2 is a good or bad move. If you see bishop b5 check, it's more than enough, because this position, black must resign. He's losing the rook, and even if he would not lose the rook, I mean, this is horrible. With those active bishops and the king on g8, none of the rooks are active. Look at the rook on h8. I mean, white is about to capture the a8 rook, and the other rook is just simply dead. So yeah, this is like two rooks down. Black should resign. That's why in this position after bishop a6, of course, it's a lot better idea to castle as black. White will also castle, and once again, this is a position where a pair of bishops will fight against a rook and a pawn. We will discuss these topics in the future with material imbalance, especially exchanges, exchange down, exchange up, a rook for minor pieces. But today's lecture is about the pair of bishops, and I want to emphasize that even if the engine doesn't give like a huge advantage, I think for a human being, playing with the two bishops is a lot easier. It's just, you see how to activate the bishops, you see that they need diagonals. They cut the board completely. Look at this bishop, how active it is, and look how powerful it is. What about the other one? It's also important. While the rooks, well, you know that you need to double rooks, you need to bring the rooks to open files first of all, and then double them on an open file, bring it to the 2nd or 7th rank if possible. But if the bishops control so many squares, it's difficult. You cannot come to the c8. Oh, I wanted to draw it with red, sorry. You cannot control the c5 because of the a6 bishop. And in general, the bishops can control so many squares that I do think in general that it's a lot easier to play with a pair of bishops. This, for the engine, is a slight advantage for white. I think in practice it's more than that, because white could soon play something like queen g4, provoke weaknesses on the king side, and it's so annoying to play against the pair of bishops. Let's see the game, because in the game it will not be a pair of bishops against a rook and a pawn, but it will be the pair of bishops against minor pieces, and that's our today's topic. We see how they fight against normal material balance. So there's a knight and bishop against the pair of bishops. Knight c6, castle, normal developing moves, castle, and here b takes c5, b takes, and d takes c5. This is a move that I believe to most of us, I would say to myself including, is a very ugly move. Isn't it ugly? I mean, look at this pawn structure. What is this? On the other hand, when you play with a pair of bishops, as I said before, pawn sacrifices should come to your mind, and secondly, ugly pawn structures too, because what you want is to open the position, and sometimes opening the position is not something aesthetic. It's not beautiful to capture on c5, but it opens the position. So you need to play dynamic positions with a pair of bishops, and sometimes you should forget about bad pawn structure. I don't say that you should completely destroy your pawn structure. Keep it safe, especially in front of your king. So don't move these guys much. Keep your king safe. That's important. But the rest of the pawns are not so important to be healthy as in other positions, because you need the position to be open. So here, Tal had the choice between capturing on c5 and on e5, and he decided that it was better to capture on e5 because he wants to keep those ugly pawns on the board. And I think we can understand it, because you feel like the c5 pawn will fall anyway, and then the c2 pawn will be weak, the a3 pawn is also isolated, so it's just a bad pawn structure for white. The problem is that the position is opening up, and by capturing on e5, he is opening the long diagonal. That will be a very important factor in the game. So let's just quickly take a look at the alternative, knight takes c5. And in this position, it's not so easy to improve white's play. Maybe he should give back one of the bishops with bishop b4. But as I said in the French, keep the light square bishop, you can give up the other one. So this exchange is actually not bad. You open the a file. Though I like the knight on e4, of course, but white's bishop is still better than the black bishop. This is roughly equal, I would say, slightly better for white, but it's a completely different story. It's not about the pair of bishops anymore. So I believe that knight takes c5 was better, even if knight takes e5 seems to be more logical, keeping the ugly pawns on the board. You want to win this c5 pawn, you don't want to just take it back instead of the e5 pawn. Let's see how Nizmedinov punishes Tal for this move. The position is still unclear. I don't want to say that this was a blunder, knight takes e5, but I just do think that in practice his position will be so difficult to defend because of knight takes e5. Queen d4. Now look at that long diagonal and look at those bishops. The knight cannot move away, he has to play f6. What would you do here as white? You should keep on playing dynamic and aggressive. What would be the move? Good job! f4, very dynamic move, chasing away the knight from the center. And this is how you should play with a pair of bishops. This is the attitude. Go for it. Knight c6, of course we move away the queen. And after rook d8, threatening d4, we just simply play rook a d1. The position, as I said, is not winning for white. Maybe it's not even better. It's just that I do think that in practice, it's easier to play this position with a pair of bishops than to defend it as black. Because after f6, the move that he had to play because of the long diagonal, the e6 pawn is weak. So he cannot move away the c8 bishop. And if he cannot move away that bishop, then this bishop will be passive, right? You cannot really do anything active about it. You just cannot dream about a5 and bishop a6. It's too slow and it would give up the e6 pawn. And if you want to connect the pawns, if you want to connect the rooks, you should play bishop d7. But the bishop on d7, well, passive once again. So it's not easy at all to play this position as black, even if it's roughly equal. And Tal, of course, didn't want to play a passive position. He wants to be active too. So he makes a mistake. He had to stay quiet, play a move like rook b8, maybe that's the best. Try to activate his pieces as much as possible, even if it's passive. But passive defense here was mainly what he needed to do. Instead, he goes active. He wants to attack as well. He wants to counterattack, get the center by playing e5. But this is just playing in the hands of the opponent. The bishop pair. Bishops love diagonals. Bishops love open positions. And the position is opening up. The f file for the f1 rook. Ouch. This diagonal and this bishop too could go to many squares. Lots of options. So this e5 move was a mistake, and now it's gonna be very difficult for black. I think even with the best play, this position should be losing sooner or later, because it's just so difficult to keep up with the threats against the black king, because the f file is right there next to the king, the long diagonal. If that diagonal is open, the king will be dead, basically. Many white pieces can get to the king side quickly and attack the black king, and there are barely any defenders. On top of that, the e5 and d5 pawns are not very solid. It's a mobile center, but here it's not a good thing to have, because white will attack these pawns in order to provoke the advance of the d pawn or the e pawn and open either the a2. Let me get rid of the diagonal of those arrows. I want to show that in the future, not right now, d4 right now would win a piece, but in general, white will want to force black push either d4 or e4, because no matter which pawn you push as black, it weakens one of the diagonals. It either weakens the long diagonal or it weakens the a2 ga diagonal against the king. If black pushes d4, there will be a very annoying bishop c4 check. So that is our plan as white, as a second step, that the position is more or less open already, open enough for the bishops. Second step that we need to achieve is that black pushes one of those pawns. First of all, he plays bishop b5, because you don't want to lose a piece. So if d4, white's idea was queen e4, attacking the knight on c6. Of course, d takes c3 is a very bad move, and it's not only about the knight. Here, actually, it's Tal who showed a beautiful variation that he calculated. Look at this. Bishop c4 check, king h8, and queen takes c6. I mean, what? This is not a Miss Tactics test. That's why I did not ask. Maybe I should have asked. I'm sorry, but I was just too excited about this move. A queen sacrifice because the back rank is weak. Wow. So this is the problem of moving these pawns. d4 is so tempting, attacking both the queen and the bishop, but it weakens the a2 ga diagonal. Queen e4 first of all, attacking the c6 knight, And if this is taken, bishop c4 check, and queen takes c6. I think it's just beautiful. And Tal saw this, but he didn't see it as him playing these moves. He saw these moves, trying to defend against these moves. So d4 is not working. Black had to play bishop b7. And now, of course, we should move the queen away from the d4 threat. Yes, we want him to push d4, but without losing a piece. So let's not lose a piece with this d4 fork. You can move the queen to many squares. Queen g5 is a good move, or queen g3 that was played in the game. But not bishop takes c6. And this I want you to tell me why. It's such a tempting move, bishop takes c6 and then capture the pawn on e5, right? Can you see what's the problem of this move, bishop takes c6? There's something wrong about it. Try to find it and calculate it. Well done, everybody. You have seen the right idea. Is that, of course, we will take back on c6 with the queen, but before we do that, there's a very important intermediate move, d4. And right now, this position is actually trouble. Not so much of a big trouble, but getting to be a trouble for white. After d4, first of all, now what do? Like, if you move the queen, it's hanging, you need to move it, right? Queen g3, and now queen takes c6. Look at that long diagonal. This is what we wanted to do as white, and now black has placed his queen and the bishop on the long diagonal. We cannot capture the pawn on e5, the g2 pawn will be hanging with a mate. Our bishop is hanging, and black is simply better. He's got these beautiful central pawns and more active pieces. What else you need as black? So suddenly, in 2 moves, everything has changed just because we were not careful. So even in positions like this, when you think that, with a pair of bishops I win easily, just make sure that you take into account the opponent's threats as well. Bishop takes c6, very tempting move, but a bad move because of d4, and then queen takes c6. And if white thinks that he was tricky and he can play bishop takes d4, then he will be surprised that even here queen takes c6 is very good and actually wins. Threat of mate and the bishop is hanging. Bad luck for white. Just make sure that before you go for careless lines, you calculate everything and you take into account the opponent's possible intermediate moves. Those are the moves that you might miss if you are careless. So careful about intermediate moves, moves that can be attacking a stronger piece, giving a check, threatening mate. Those are very, very strong intermediate moves. I've just seen a question in the chat about the previous back rank mate that Tal suggested, that he calculated this position. I think he was giving the bishop c4 check Let me go back there. I think he wanted to give that check so that it's more beautiful. I mean, it's Tal. This is how he played. So in the position when we were discussing, I'm trying to find it, d4, queen e4, and d takes c3. Of course, it is possible to play queen takes c6 first, and that's what everybody would do. The knight was just hanging, no matter what, right? You can take it, you don't have to sacrifice the queen. But this is Mikhail Tal annotating a game, and he says that here the best move is bishop c4 check, because after king h8 he can sacrifice his queen. So you see that he was a great player, world champion, so many brilliant games that are now proved by the engine that his sacrifices, most of them were correct. So he was a real magician, understanding so much the tactical possibilities of the position. But he also understood the aesthetics, the beauty of chess. That's why bishop c4 check is necessary for Tal, because he wants to finish the game as beautiful as possible. So yes, it's true that bishop c4 was not necessary. It's necessary for Mikhail Tal. Now let's go back to the position we were discussing before. It is here after bishop b7, moving the queen away. And now rook d7. Of course, black should try to defend his position, bring the other rook as well. And I think this is once again a good moment to let you think, what would you do here? Because it's a beautiful position. All our pieces are well placed. But there's nothing concrete. You don't want to capture on c6 really, because it would give up the bishop for no reason. When you have the pair of bishops, I say that you can give it up, you can give up one of the bishops. It's not like you have to keep it forever, but give it up when it makes sense. It doesn't make sense to exchange the e5 pawn for the c5 pawn. We are not winning a pawn. So bishop takes c6 is not a move that you would want to play. If there's nothing direct and all your pieces are nice, what can you do? Well, what you should do is to improve your pieces even more. What do you think? How could you improve your pieces here even more? Which pieces and where? Let's try to make a plan which pieces to improve. There are two very good moves in this position, and both of those moves involve the rook, because the rook is a piece that you can improve in this position. The f file is an open file, so why not double rooks on the f file? You can do that either by playing rook f2, that's what Nesmetdinov did, or you can play rook f5. Maybe that's even stronger, more active. You are attacking the e5 pawn. Maybe we will not take on c6, but it's always good to keep it in the air. Like, we might take, we might not take. Just threaten the pawn on e5 by playing rook f5. So rook f5 is a great move. Also rook f2. This is the game. Trying to double rooks on the f file, improving your pieces even more. So if there's nothing direct, keep on improving your pieces. In any position, not only with a pair of bishops, any position, you have a position where there's nothing concrete going on, keep on improving your pieces. Rook e8, and now a funny thing is that he didn't play rook df1. I thought when I saw the game that he went rook f2 because he wanted to double rooks. Maybe that was his initial plan, but now he changed his mind and he goes h3. This is a mysterious move to me. I still don't understand it, and I have analyzed the game, so imagine. I can't explain the move h3 because I think it was not necessary. Yes, sometimes we want to open the back rank, so there will be nothing going on, but there's no f-pawn and there's no back rank problem, so I'm not sure why he played h3. That's the only mysterious move in this game that you will see. Bishop a8, because poor Tal has not much to do. He just has to wait and try to keep everything defended, but he has no possibility of creating counterplay, and I think that's very painful for a player like Tal, that he could not do anything active in this game. If he goes d4, that's what I was talking about before. Every time one of the pawn advances, it gives up a diagonal. That diagonal is weakened, and now after rook d f1, this position is really bad. We are threatening with the back rank mate. Then we can move the bishop away. Of course, we don't want to give it up forever, but for a mate we would. And the bishop on this diagonal will be also very unpleasant. So d4 is never a good idea. So he plays bishop a8. Unfortunately for him, it's a sad move, but he is waiting. And now once again I thought that rook df1 should be the move, right? No, Niezhmedinov thought that bishop a4 is better. It's an interesting idea. I don't know if it's the best, but it's interesting because sometimes this bishop could go to b3 and you would see two bishops that are, first of all, attacking the d5 and e5 central pawns of black, and by attacking those pawns, those bishops will be targeting the black king. So those bishops, I mean, when you see the pair of bishops working together like on parallel diagonals on b3 and c3, that is like when you really see the power of these bishops. They can control so many squares parallelly to each other. So I understand bishop a4, even if I would love to double rooks already. So he keeps the rook on d1 because the idea of bishop b3 makes sense when the rook is on d1. So the d5 pawn should be hanging. That's why he still keeps the rook on d1. Maybe he will double rooks, but not yet because he's going for this bishop b3 idea as well. So he's combining more ideas at the same time, and actually it's a good idea in general to have more thoughts, not just going for one direct attack. No, he says, I might threaten the d5 pawn, I might double rooks on the f file. It's very annoying for the opponent to keep on pending on all these threats. Like, will he attack my pawn? Will he double rooks? You never know. Bishop b7 was played, and now king h1. Once again a funny move, but this I can explain, because in many lines when we capture on c6, we might capture one day. The pawn was always hanging on c5 with a check. So that's why he keeps the rook on h1 instead of on g1. Bishop a8 once again, and finally rook f5. So yeah, that was the move that he could have played a few moves ago as well, but if you have such a position as white, actually you are not in a rush. You see that the last moves of black were bishop b7, bishop a8, bishop b7, bishop a8. If your opponent has nothing to do and he is just waiting, even moves like h3, king h1, rook f2, rook f5 are not a problem. You're just playing with the nerves of your opponent, because enjoy the position, enjoy that you are better, and you don't have to win on the spot. You just improve your pieces step by step. There's nothing concrete, no direct win, so enjoy the game, and you don't have to always play the best moves. If you keep on improving the position, you are heading towards the right direction. You're heading in the right direction. So rook f5 finally appeared on the board, putting even more pressure on those central pawns, and now Tal cracked, because it's just so difficult to keep on moving pieces back and forth. I think that his position is lost anyway, so maybe cracked is not the right expression. His position is bad. It's just simply bad. So I don't know what he could do. Maybe nothing. If he plays d4, then of course we get the diagonal we wanted for the bishop, bishop b3 check. And after king h8, finally we would double rooks, threatening back rank mate, queen d8, and now what would you play here? Tell me, because I think that you like Miss Tactics' show as well. We are not sacrificing anything yet, but just keep on attacking. How would you attack here? Beautiful, that's the way to play rook f7. All rooks want to have the 7th rank, 2nd rank, whatever you call it. In this case, the 7th rank. And yeah, this position is very sad. Threatening mate on g7, rook g8 has to be played, and now we move the bishop away. And yeah, there's no sacrifice or such, but this is winning. And just to show how Tal analyzes, in this position he gives the following line. How white would win after e4. He goes bishop g5, and after queen e8, rook c7, and his idea is that now the rook is hanging on g8, of course, he has to move it, and he can play bishop f6. Beautiful, because it could be captured with 2 pieces, but none of them works. It's mate on g7, no matter what. Black has no way to avoid the mate on g7. So, if rook f7, I'm sure that now you know how Mikhail Tal would think about this position. He would say that obviously it's not bishop takes g7, but queen takes g7, and this is a beautiful mate with a pair of bishops, showing how powerful these bishops are when they control parallel diagonals. The king is in check and cannot move to g8. The bishops are giving a mate without a queen on the board. Yeah, pair of bishops. So yeah, this is a beautiful line that Tal has given in his analysis. Did not happen. He went e4, swapping queens, but this is just a pawn down for black, so that's why this move was also not helping, although at least he's not getting mated, right? Maybe he thought he was not getting mated without queens, but look at that rook once again on the 7th rank. And after e2, it's your turn to once again see how would you give mate. Yeah, let's say, how would you give mate? How to keep on attacking the black king even without queens. Let's be Mikhail Tal, even against Mikhail Tal. What would you play here? Yes, that's it. It's easy, but still it's beautiful, so I wanted you to say it instead of me shouting out bishop b3 check. Rook e6 was played in the game because after king f8 or king h8 it's mate. Once again, the power of the bishops on parallel diagonals. So rook e6, and but it's still mate. It's a rook down and a mate, so on top of that, look at this mate. The pair of bishops once again controlling parallel squares and the rooks, of course. So this is rook up and a beautiful finish for a beautiful game. I think Najmedinov played impressively this game and many of his games against Tal and other world champions and great players of those times. So if you haven't heard about him before, make sure to check some of his best games because they are very instructive as well. I saw a question before that if rook f7, let me go back to that position. Here is instead of rook takes f7, why not g6? That was the question in the chat. So let me answer that first. G6 is not a losing move right now. Like there's no direct refutation of g6, but in general, if you don't have a dark squared bishop and you weaken the dark squares, you will be punished sooner or later. And here the punishment is that this bishop will be placed on those squares. So bishop g5, bishop f6 is a huge threat. Also bishop h6, bishop g7. So in a few moves it will be made, believe me. Even without blundering this Tal idea of sacrificing, as always, with bishop f6 in that line with rook g8. Even in this position after g6, black is lost because with those holes on the dark squares, you cannot protect those squares. There's no piece. You don't have a dark squared bishop. So g6, no, unfortunately it doesn't work. It's a good try, of course, if you see that the other line is not working, but it also doesn't help. It was a good question though. So always make sure that you ask your questions and I try to answer them. If I see them in the chat, I try to read everything. Sometimes I don't manage, but I'm trying. Let's see the last game that we have for today. And it's a Kasparov game, as announced before. Kasparov with the black pieces playing his favorite opening, the Najdorf. And I wanted to mention that this game I saw from a book that I want to recommend to you if you want to see more games on minor pieces, because it's an entire game, an entire book full of games of minor piece power. That's the title actually, Power Chess with Pieces. And it was written by Jan Timman. So Power Chess with Pieces by Jan Timman is an entire book on minor pieces. Some of the games discuss the pair of bishops, others discuss strong knight against the bishop, others, I don't know, all kinds of knight and bishop games. Sometimes the knight is better, sometimes the bishops are stronger. If you are curious about these topics, then I do recommend that you get Timman's book, because there are very few books. I only know about this book that is a full book only on this topic, on minor pieces in the middle game mainly and also in the end game. So make sure that if you are interested in this topic, then you check this book. There are also, of course, other strategy books, John Nunn's books, for instance, where he discusses many of these topics too, the pair of bishops, knight outposts, so good knight against bad bishop, or bishops outplaying knights. Those are very good too, but those are books that cover general topics too, so other topics from the middle game. If you want only the minor pieces, then you need Timman's book. If you want other topics too from the middle game and a few games from about bishop pair, stronger knight, then get some of John Nunn's strategy books, his books on the middle games. There are various books, so make sure that you find those books. You always ask me what books I recommend, so I thought that this was the moment to recommend Timman and Nunn on these topics. Let's go for the game. It's the Najdorf, as I said. Kasparov's favorite opening, his favorite weapon against Alexei Shirov, who is also a very strong, creative and aggressive player. Similar style as Kasparov. Not as successful as Kasparov was, of course, but it's difficult to be greater than Garry Kasparov. This is going to be a crazy line. This bishop e3, knight g4, h6, where black is pushing the king side pawns right ahead. And soon we will reach the position that we wanted. Pair of bishops for black. And it's a very different pair of bishops, because here what we will see is that it's not an average position. White has just castled, king side. He's castling where the black pawns are pushed already, but he's castling because he should finish his development. The black king is still in the center, so it's not like it's not like the game is decided, right? It's not like black can give mate. No, black should finish his development first. And it's still a question where the black king will go. Will black castle kingside with those advanced pawns, or will he castle queenside with the c-file semi-open? Maybe castle queenside would be safer, but not for Kasparov. So we will soon see where he places his king. And what I want you to observe in this game too is what he does with the bishop. So how he wants to open diagonals for those bishops. First of all, knight c6, bishop f2, and here e6 is a move that I believe it was Kasparov who played it first, because now this is the main move in this position, but I think that this was the first game where this was actually played, and rook c8 happened in previous games. So e6, credits to Kasparov for yet another opening improvement. He had many of those. Knight c e2, maybe knight takes c6 could have been considered, but it leads only to an equal position. This is the way to neutralize the pair of bishops. Exchange one of the bishops, right? But black has this move, bishop e5, which happens often in the Sicilian. If you play the Sicilian or you play against the Sicilian, you must have seen this move, that black is not afraid of doubling pawns on e5 because those pawns cover so many central squares. So having double pawns in the center is actually cool because the center is the most important and you are covering lots of squares. And the exchange of queens is not something that you want to avoid. This is an equal position. Not much to talk about it today, because today we are not discussing bishop against knight endgames. We in general discuss middle games, and also today the pair of bishops. So let's just see the game. This topic will come up in another session. Instead of knight c6, knight ce2 was played, and after knight e5, which is of course a very logical move, placing the knight on e5, a beautiful place. It's almost like an I can't speak anymore, I'm sorry. It's almost like an outpost because white cannot push f4. So our knight on e5 is a brilliant piece. It's a monster. It cannot be chased away. I love these kind of pieces. Even if today's topic is about bishops, I love the knight in the center when it cannot be chased away. So the knight on d4, of course, always in the Sicilian is very nice for white, and the knight on e5 for black. b3, preventing that the knight jumps to c4 at some point, and also white wants to push c4 and get a Marotti setup. g4 and f4. What would you play here in this position? Would you move the knight away, or would you play something else? Let me see if there's anyone brave enough to keep the knight on e5 when it's hanging. Let's see what happened, because I see that you guys are talking about another game in the chat. No problem. I like that you have such a wide knowledge of these games in the Najdorf or other openings that you like, that you play by the greatest chess players in history. But this is not the game where Kasparov blunders. This is a game where he crushes Alexei Shirov. So he plays h4 because the knight is not hanging on e5 actually. If the knight is taken after d takes e5, the d4 knight is trapped. It sounds crazy because the knight is in the center, but there's just no square where the knight could go. So it is trapped in the middle of the board. That's why after f4, black can continue his expanding on the king side with h4, bishop e3, and now h3. He wants to weaken the light squares. Why the light squares? Because white doesn't have a light square bishop. This is what I was emphasizing today, and this is what you should remember from today. If there's one thing that you learned today, this should be it. The pair of bishops, you know that they are powerful, but make sure that when you play with the pair of bishops, you try to weaken the squares that are on the color of the bishop that the opponent doesn't have. White doesn't have a light squared bishop. This is so important. He doesn't have a light squared bishop, so you want to weaken the light squares. h3 is the perfect example, because after g3, it is true that black did not manage to open the h file, but what he managed is that there are so many weaknesses now in the king side on the light squares, and once he manages to open the long diagonal for his bishop, this will be so painful for white. That bishop will decide the game if he can do this. So weaken the squares that are on the color of the bishop that the opponent lacks. In case of a bishop pair, and also when you have a bishop against a knight. So when the opponent is missing a bishop, make sure that you weaken the squares that are on the color of the missing bishop. h3, of course, is a very strong move because of this reason, and once again f takes e5 was no big deal. We can even take on g2 first, and after king takes g2, queen h4, threatening mate and such, and then we will capture on e5. If rook f2, then d takes e5, and once again the knight is trapped in the center. So h3, g3 is necessary, but first step accomplished. Kasparov has weakened those light squares on the king side. Next step is to place the bishop on the long diagonal. For that, he needs to exchange the d4 knight. Knight c6, the knight was hanging, he places it on c6, he wants the bishop on c6. Queen d3, and now castle. He finishes his development with a scary looking castle, king side. I mean, look at those pawns. I always teach that you should not castle on the side where you advance your pawns, right? But this is an example. There are always many examples, and here the funny thing is that even without the g and h pawns in front of the black king, white has no way to attack our king. There are just no white pieces near the black king, nor a path for the pieces to get there. If he tries f5, let's say, this is an attempt that you should take account of, because f5 might look scary, you have just castled. But knight e5, f5 has weakened the e5 square, and after queen d2, we just capture on f5. E takes f5 or knight takes f5, but knight takes would lose material. We capture the knight first, just to eliminate this dangerous piece, and then we win an exchange because of knight f3. I say that we should eliminate this knight first because this position is not so bad if white manages to take our bishop. So make sure that if you castle in such a scary place like this, king side, just make sure that you keep your bishop alive. Unless you win lots of material and you have other pieces that can cover your king. So don't give up your defenders, the knight on e5 and the bishop on g7. Don't give them up, both of them. You need at least one of them to keep your king safe. If not, your king will be weak because there are no pawns defending it. So e takes f5 for instance, and then this position with rook e8. Look at the knight on e5, the bishop on g7, and those pawns on g4 and h3 are safe mainly because of the knight on e5. So this is such an important place, an outpost. It's an outpost because there's no pawn that can kick out the knight from e5. Very important to note. Another thing could be, well, if f5 doesn't work, then the move that was played in the game is rook a d1. Logical, bringing the rook to the semi-open d file, and this is a weakness, the d6 pawn, so it's a good idea, isn't it? But now Kasparov plays f5 and builds a very nice looking pawn chain, a very strong pawn chain, especially this h3 and g4 pawns. You will see in the game how annoying they are. So f5, provoking white to open the position. If he captures on f5, then we will take back, and we have improved the position in a way that we are opening it for the bishops. Yes, we have a backward pawn, an isolated weak pawn on d6, but remember that when you have the pair of bishops, you should somehow forget about the strategic weaknesses a bit. You put them in brackets because you want to play dynamic, you want to open the position, and sometimes giving up a pawn, having a structural weakness is not bad if you compensate it with the pair of bishops. So f5 is therefore a great move. c4 was the response of Shirov, and now queen a5. And here is the moment when I believe that queen d2 was the best, because if your king is weak, and here I believe that white's king is in more danger than black's king. So if you feel that your king can get into trouble, exchange queens. You want the queens off of the board. If your king is in trouble, exchange queens. Queen d2 is therefore, I think, a necessary move. And this endgame is not bad. After f takes e4, white wins back the pawn on d6, and now we reach a position where the pair of bishops is bad. It doesn't happen often, but in positions where there's not enough attack, it does matter that your pawns are destroyed. This pawn structure is weak. The c6 bishop is not strong because it doesn't have a diagonal. So the pair of bishops doesn't win immediately any game. It doesn't always mean that you will be better because of the pair of bishops. You will be better if you can open the position and you can play very dynamic and attacking chess. If your bishop or bishops, depending on whether it's one or two, but if one of them at least doesn't have a diagonal, it might not be an advantage at all. So structural weaknesses will count, especially in endgames. Make sure that you take care of this, that if your queens if the queens are exchanged, maybe that structural weakness will not be good anymore. So this is, I think, what white should have played. Of course, black doesn't have to take on e4. Maybe it's better to play rook f7, keep the position safe. I think this is roughly equal. But what happens in the game is that there will be queens on the board and lots of danger. Kasparov brings the last piece that was undeveloped, the rook, bringing it to e8 and preparing to strike. Because once you have all your pieces in the best possible location, because here it's very difficult to keep on improving them. There are no open files where you could double rooks. There's no clear diagonal for the bishops. What you need to do here is to open the position even more, because it's not so much open. We have only exchanged a pair of pawns. So you should open the position even more. And the move to do that is, you tell me, what's the move here? Well done, it is e5. Of course we should open the position, let's go for it. That's why he placed his rook on e8. So he wants to open the e file and the f file in order to have an open position for the bishops and for the rooks, because look at those rooks ready to attack. So e5, very important move, and it's not so easy anymore for white to react. Perhaps the best was coming back with the knight, even though it's ugly. And there could be lots of things happening, like capturing on f4, knight jump to e5. This is just one line that I analyzed just to demonstrate that in many positions white will be in trouble, not because he's losing something immediately. He will be in trouble because of the pair of bishops. The position is opening up for the rooks, for black's rooks, and for the bishops. And this diagonal will be especially painful. I have announced it before and I'm saying it once again. So this could be problematic. But we are here not only to learn how to play with the pair of bishops and how to attack with the pair of bishops, but also to learn how to defend. And I have said it and I will repeat it, that when your king is in trouble, what you should do is, you tell me. I have said it a million times, please repeat it. What you need to do when your king is in trouble. That's it, I'm happy. It was worth it. I have said it maybe 50 times during this year of 2016, but it was worth it because when you are in trouble, at least when your king is about to be in trouble, do exchange queens. So queen d5. Not resign, Leska, that's a good comment, but don't resign, don't freak out. We have learned that you should never give up. So never give up, even if you are in a worse position. Keep hoping, keep believing, because the opponent is a human being. Most of the times, unless you're playing against the computer, but most of the times your opponent can make mistakes too. Exchange queens if your king is about to be in trouble. Without the queens, this position is not so bad. Queen d5, queen takes, knight takes, and after bishop b2, of course those rooks are annoying, the e4 pawn is hanging, but at least your king is not getting mated. That's something. So this could have been an option, but e5 is still a very strong move, and I think that this position for black is beautiful. The position is opening up for the bishops and for the rooks, so it's difficult for white to respond in the best way. He took on c6, which is, I think, not the best move. Also knight takes f5. That would have been a huge blunder. Bishop takes f5, and now after e takes f4, two pieces are hanging. So white is lost. e5, knight takes c6 is the game. But this is what Kasparov wanted. He wanted to place his bishop on the long diagonal. The other bishop is also on the long diagonal on g7. So both of the bishops are on the most important diagonals. The position is about to open up. There's so much pressure in the center because of this e5 and f5 pawns and the rooks. So it's really, really unpleasant to play this as white. Therefore, Shirov decides to sacrifice a pawn with b4, which is, I think, in practice a good idea, because you should try to confuse your opponent. Don't keep the position just passive for you and waiting for the opponent to crush you. No, you should try to make him make mistakes. b4, an interesting pawn sacrifice, but the funny thing is that Gary doesn't even want the pawn, because this position is better for black. He should calculate what happens after knight d5, but it's possible to take the pawn. But Kasparov rightly prefers a position where it's equal material but lots of threats. After queen a3, he's threatening e takes f4. Once again, two pieces would be hanging, so white has to react. He has to play something. If he goes knight e2, then this exchange of queens is very different from the previous line that we have seen. The position opening up, it doesn't matter actually in which order, but we will reach a position like this. This is just to demonstrate that even without the queens, it can be horrible to play against the pair of bishops if the bishops are very active. And here the rooks are very active too, and white's pieces are pinned. The d6 bishop is pinned, the e2 knight is pinned. It's just impossible to avoid losing material. The c4 pawn is hanging too, just to mention one more. So this is a horrible position. White is lost with equal material on the board because there are too many threats to parry. He cannot. So queen a3 is the best move. Not accepting the pawn, but keeping the threats alive. And if white plays what happened in the game, b5, then e takes f4 is the best move. I don't need you to calculate this because I think we should just sit back, all of us, including me, and enjoy the show that Garry Kasparov produced in this game, opening the diagonal of the g7 bishop after bishop takes. Of course, if this bishop is captured, then which piece would you capture? The c3 knight or the e3 bishop? I said I would not ask more questions but let you enjoy the show, but I'm not that nice. I'm sorry. I want you to answer. Is it the knight that you would capture or the bishop? But real quick, you should tell me very quickly. Let's discuss this because I have seen that most of you would want to capture the knight. It's not a bad idea actually. I think you want to take the knight because you see some tactics going on. You want white to capture the queen, and in that case both the rook and the bishop will be hanging. He's not losing material. I mean, not the bishop at least. He can play bishop d2, but it's true that this position is bad. Bishop d4 and then you take on g3, everything is hanging, the e4 pawn too. This is of course very good for black. After queen c3, the only thing is that when you calculate a line like this, don't consider queen takes c3 for white the only option. We tend to analyze lines and calculate like saying that queen takes c3, queen takes, bishop takes, as if it was forced. It's not forced, and therefore queen takes c3 for white is not the best move and it's not obligatory. He can play, for instance, bishop takes f4, and this position, even though it is better for black, it's not such a huge advantage. So make sure that when you calculate, you always take into account that not every line is forced. So queen takes c3, it's true that queen takes c3 for, if white plays it, then black will have an enormous advantage, but it's not forced. So f takes e3 is better, not because of a direct calculation, but because of the simple thing that you want to keep the bishop, the g7 bishop, playing on the dark squares with nobody challenging the bishop. If there's no bishop for white, then this bishop, the g7 bishop, will be even more powerful than before. It was very powerful on the long diagonal, but now imagine this bishop appearing on d4, for instance, or on this diagonal. There is just no white bishop. Suddenly all the dark squares will be very weak because we have a bishop, the opponent doesn't. So it's not a calculation that would make me capture the bishop in this position. Of course, you should always validate your opinion with a calculation, but in general, you have a bishop that is powerful. You want to make it more powerful, take off the opponent's bishop, and then your bishop is the only piece, the only minor piece that can control the dark squares. So that's the reason. And in this position, if the knight moves away, you can see that we are even winning material. So on the long run, it should be justified that we have decided to play this. Now we have a pawn up and rook f2. This position is very good. Queen c3 is also good, but taking the bishop off of the board when you want to make your bishop even more powerful is a general tip that I want to give you. So you like your bishop, make it even more powerful by capturing the opponent's bishop with a different piece. E takes f4. This is the game. Bishop takes f4. And now after a takes b5, c takes b5, queen c5 check. Of course the bishop is hanging on c6, but the knight is also... Kasparov gives this check because it's annoying. It's annoying because white doesn't really want to go king h1, so he plays bishop e3, but that means that the bishop is more passive. It's not attacking the d6 pawn as it was attacking from f4. And after queen takes, b takes c6, we reach a position where there's no pair of bishops anymore. We have traded our pair of bishops for a pawn up, because this is a pawn up after all. And it's not only the pawn up that we have, but a very weak white king and very active black pieces. All the black pieces are powerful, the white king is weak, and it's just very difficult to defend this position. Also, of course, the extra pawn helps, but in general, look at the queen on e4, the rook on e8, and the fianchetto bishop that we have. This g7 bishop is very powerful. Queen d5, of course, white should exchange queens. His king was about to be in big trouble. Mate on g2. It's a good idea to exchange queens, but he cannot survive. Even like this, bishop c3, a very accurate move in order to create a pin on the e file. And this pin will be mortal. There's no escape from this pin, because after rook d2, this was the last mistake that Shirov committed, but his position was bad anyway. I mean, it's a pawn up, down and passive pieces. So he played rook d2, and I want you to tell me the finishing blow. What is the winning tactical tool in this position? A tiny little tactical calculation that you need in order to win this game on the spot now. I think Christian and Scott were the fastest, but I see many more comments coming in, all saying rook takes e3. So I'm so proud of everyone. I see that you pay attention whenever Sopiko streams her tactics shows. Rook takes e3, rook takes, rook takes. This is a simple sacrifice in order to get into a winning pawn endgame. And it's winning because we have a pawn up. But not only that, of course it would win no matter what. But you don't even need to make 10, 20 more moves to win this pawn endgame. You win on the spot once again. You need to tell me how. Right now. Good job everyone, I can't even read out the names. Lenska, Christian, Keksia, I think all of you have said it, Kramnik student. Congratulations everybody who have said, even if I did not shout out the names, I'm trying to read all the comments. Jatinder Singh and Sir Toby, everyone was saying, and Javi. Rook takes e3 was the beginning of the combination, and f4 is the last thing that you needed to see. A breakthrough, a brilliant breakthrough in order to promote a pawn. We sacrifice first the f pawn, then the g pawn, and we promote the h pawn. This was just a beautiful finishing touch to a very well played game by Garry Kasparov in the Najdorf, showing how powerful the bishops can be. And what you should learn from these games is, first of all, that the pair of bishops is cool. It's great to have the pair of bishops, but you should know how to play when having the pair of bishops. You should, as usual for the bishops, you should open the position as much as possible. Sometimes you can even sacrifice a pawn for opening the position, or 2 pawns. So sacrificing material in order to open diagonals for the bishops is something that you should consider. It sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. Consider it. Also consider sometimes that having an ugly pawn structure, like the one we saw in Tal's game, Nezhmedninov had a very ugly pawn structure. Sometimes that can happen too, that it compensates, that you have the pair of bishops. I will show once again because I think it's nicer to talk about ugly pawn structure when you see it actually. So he decided to take on c5. I want to go back to that exact moment as a summary for today's lecture, that he on purpose ruins his pawn structure. He played b4 first, and then he takes on c5, and he plays this position with horrible pawns, doubled isolated pawns on the queen side, all for the sake of opening the position for the bishops. And it was worth it because the long diagonal, if you remember, decided basically the whole game. So it is worth it to open the position for the bishops by weakening your pawn structure. So you accept a strategic disadvantage for the sake of a dynamic advantage. And last but not least, remember that when you have a bishop, whether it's a pair of bishops or it's a bishop against a knight, remember that the bishop you have and the opponent doesn't have can be the most powerful piece. And it will be the king of the board if you weaken squares on that color. So if you manage to force the opponent, push g6 in this position, then it will be a horrible, horrible, horrible king side because you have a dark squared bishop and black doesn't. So keep in mind this. You can always use this tool, this strategic tool, weakening the color, the squares on the color of the bishop that is missing from the opponent's position. I hope that you enjoyed these games, and remember that next Wednesday we will practice everything that we have learned today. So we will have a thematic tournament on the topic of the pair of bishops with my live commentary. So that means that I will be commentating your games while you are playing, and I will be telling you what you do well and what you can improve. So I will try to give tips to everybody how can they improve their chess in terms of the pair of bishops and in general as well. So I hope that it will be a useful session, and I will see you next Wednesday. Remember that tomorrow you have a show with Miss Tactics, so you can and you should improve your tactical skills as well. I will see you next Wednesday. Bye bye.